Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The autumn rain hammers against the windows of the small estate sale house on Maple Street in Asheville, North Carolina, creating rhythmic patterns that seem to echo the passage of time itself. Inside, Margaret Foster moves slowly through rooms packed with the accumulated possessions of 8 decades, her trained eye scanning for items of historical value amid the clutter of ordinary life. At 62 years old, Margaret has spent the last 30 years working as an archivist and historical preservation specialist, and estate sales have become her hunting ground for forgotten pieces of American history. The musty smell of old paper and wood polish fills her nostrils as she carefully examines box after box of documents, photographs, and personal effects left behind by Clara Hannon, who passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 97 with no living relatives to claim her belongings. The house itself speaks of a life lived in quiet solitude. Floral wallpaper peels at the corners, revealing layers of patterns from different decades. The furniture is solid but worn, pieces that have witnessed countless meals, conversations, and silent evenings. Margaret notices the way sunlight, filtered through the rain-streaked windows, creates dancing shadows across the hardwood floors, and she feels the weight of loneliness that seems to permeate every corner of this space. Clara Hannon had been a retired schoolteacher, according to the estate documents, never married, no children, and the last of her family line. The realization saddens Margaret in a way that these sales often do, reminding her of how lives can narrow to a single point before disappearing entirely from the world's memory. In the back bedroom, converted long ago into a storage space, Margaret discovers a cedar chest pushed against the far wall beneath a window that overlooks an overgrown garden. The chest is locked, but the key hangs on a nail beside it, suggesting Clara had meant for someone to open it eventually. Margaret's hands tremble slightly with anticipation as she turns the key and lifts the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and aged paper rushes out, and inside she finds carefully organized stacks of photographs, letters, and documents, each bundle wrapped in tissue paper and tied with faded ribbon. This level of preservation suggests these items held enormous significance for Clara, treasures she protected but perhaps could not bear to revisit regularly. Margaret begins to sort through the materials methodically, her archival training guiding her movements. She wears white cotton gloves to protect the delicate papers from the oils in her skin. Most of the photographs date from the early to mid-20th century, showing stern-faced people in formal clothing standing before farmhouses and churches. The letters are written in various hands, some elegant and flowing, others cramped and difficult to decipher. As she examines each item, Margaret creates a mental catalog, noting dates, locations, and recurring names. The Hannon family history begins to take shape before her, a story written in fading ink and sepia tones. Near the bottom of the chest, Margaret finds a large photograph mounted on thick cardboard backing, the kind popular in the 1890s. The image shows a family of 7 standing in front of a simple wooden house with mountains visible in the background. The father stands tall and rigid in the center, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who appears to be about 10 years old. The mother sits in a wooden chair holding an infant, her expression revealing exhaustion and weariness. 4 other children of varying ages arrange themselves around their parents, their faces serious in the manner required by the long exposure times of early photography. Someone has written on the back in careful script, "Hannon Family, 1894, Watauga County." Margaret turns the photograph over several times, studying both the image and the inscription, sensing something significant about this particular item but unable to articulate what draws her attention. The photograph's condition troubles Margaret. Water damage has created dark stains along the bottom edge, and the image itself has faded significantly, making it difficult to distinguish details in the darker areas. The cardboard backing has warped with age and moisture, causing the photograph to curl slightly at the corners. As a preservation specialist, Margaret knows this photograph needs immediate professional restoration if its image and historical value are to be saved. She sets it aside carefully, already planning to take it to her friend Robert Chin, who owns a restoration studio in downtown Asheville and specializes in recovering damaged historical photographs using both traditional and modern digital techniques. Margaret spends another 2 hours documenting the contents of the cedar chest, photographing each item with her phone and making detailed notes about dates, names, and potential historical significance. The story that emerges is one of hardship and survival in the Appalachian Mountains during a time when families carved out existences from unforgiving land through sheer determination and backbreaking labor. The letters speak of crop failures, harsh winters, childhood illnesses, and the constant struggle to maintain even a basic standard of living. Yet there are also moments of joy recorded in these documents: births, marriages, rare celebrations, and expressions of love between family members separated by distance or circumstance. Margaret feels privileged to handle these intimate records of lives lived more than a century ago. When she finally leaves the estate sale house, Margaret carries the cedar chest to her car, having purchased it and all its contents for $300. The rain has stopped, and the evening air smells of wet leaves and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. As she drives home through the winding mountain roads, Margaret cannot stop thinking about the family photograph, about the faces of those children and the lives they must have lived in those mountains. Something about the image nags at her consciousness, a feeling she has learned to trust over her years of historical work. Important discoveries often announce themselves this way, through intuition rather than logical analysis. Margaret's small house sits on the outskirts of Asheville, a converted cottage surrounded by oak trees and mountain laurel. She lives alone, having divorced 15 years ago, her children now grown and living in other cities pursuing their own careers. The house reflects her passion for history, with every room containing carefully curated collections of books, documents, and artifacts. She has created what she thinks of as a personal museum, a space where the past lives alongside the present in comfortable coexistence. Tonight, as she brings the cedar chest inside and places it on her dining room table, Margaret feels the familiar excitement that comes with new research, the promise of stories waiting to be uncovered and understood. She makes herself a cup of tea and sits down to examine the family photograph more closely under her desk lamp's bright light. Using a magnifying glass, Margaret studies each face, trying to read personalities and relationships in the set of jaws, the positioning of bodies, the ways hands rest or grip. The father appears stern and weathered, a man shaped by hard work and probably limited education. The mother looks much older than she probably was, worn down by repeated pregnancies and the endless labor required to maintain a household without modern conveniences. The children's expressions range from frightened to defiant, each one already understanding that life would demand everything from them and give little in return. Margaret's attention keeps returning to the second oldest boy, the one standing slightly apart from his siblings with his hands clenched at his sides. Unlike the others, who gaze directly at the camera with varying degrees of discomfort, this boy looks off to the side, his face turned just enough to make his features difficult to distinguish in the faded photograph. There is tension in his posture, a sense of being present but not part of the family group. Margaret wonders about his story, about what might have caused this visible separation from his siblings. She makes a note to ask Robert if the restoration process might bring out more detail in this boy's face and expression. The following morning, Margaret drives to Robert Chen's studio, located in a renovated warehouse in Asheville's River Arts District. Robert has been restoring and preserving historical photographs for 25 years, and his reputation extends far beyond North Carolina. He combines traditional photographic techniques with cutting-edge digital restoration methods, often producing results that seem almost miraculous. Margaret has worked with him on dozens of projects, and she trusts his judgment and discretion completely. When she shows him the Hannon family photograph, Robert's expression shifts immediately from casual interest to focused attention. Robert examines the photograph under various lights, using different magnification tools and occasionally making soft sounds of professional assessment. He explains that the water damage is significant but not catastrophic, and the fading can likely be reversed through careful digital restoration. However, he warns that the process will take time, possibly several weeks, because he wants to proceed cautiously to ensure no information is lost or inadvertently altered. He estimates the cost at $1,500, and Margaret agrees immediately, knowing that historical societies and museums often fund such preservation work if the results prove significant. Robert promises to call her as soon as he has initial results to show. 3 weeks pass before Robert contacts Margaret, and when he does, His voice carries an unusual note of urgency. He asks her to come to the studio immediately, saying he has discovered something unexpected in the restoration process that she needs to see in person. Margaret's heart races as she drives through downtown Asheville, imagining what Robert might have found. Perhaps a previously unknown photographer's mark, or details that would allow them to identify the specific location of the Hannon farm with greater precision, or maybe evidence of a significant historical event captured in the background of the image. She parks quickly and hurries into the studio, where Robert waits with an expression that combines excitement and discomfort. Robert's studio occupies a large open space filled with specialized equipment, computer monitors, and work tables covered with photographs in various stages of restoration. The November sunlight streams through tall windows, creating pools of natural light that Robert augments with carefully positioned lamps. He leads Margaret to his main workstation, where multiple monitors display the Hannon family photograph in various stages of enhancement. The transformation is remarkable. What had been a faded, barely discernible image now shows sharp detail and a full range of tonal values. Every face is clear, the texture of clothing visible, even individual boards in the house's siding distinct. Margaret gasps at the quality of the restoration, but Robert quickly directs her attention to something else. He pulls up an image showing just the bottom portion of the photograph, the area that had suffered the most severe water damage in the original. Through careful digital reconstruction and analysis of microscopic details, Robert has managed to reveal information that had been completely invisible before. Behind the family, partially obscured by the father's body and the sitting mother, there appears to be a document of some kind tacked to the wall of the house. In the original photograph, this document would have been nothing more than a vague rectangular shape, easily dismissed as a random shadow or imperfection. However, Robert's restoration has brought out enough detail to reveal that the document contains text and what appears to be signatures. Robert explains his process as he zooms in on the document. Using a combination of techniques including multispectral imaging analysis, artificial intelligence-based pattern recognition, and careful manual enhancement, he has managed to extract nearly every word from the document despite the indirect angle and partial obscuration. The results appear on another monitor, showing the reconstructed text in a format that looks like a legal document or contract. Margaret leans forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she focuses on the words that Robert has painstakingly recovered from more than a century of deterioration and damage. The document is dated March 15, 1894, just weeks before the photograph was taken based on Clara's notation. The header identifies it as a deed of transfer and exchange, witnessed by a justice of the peace in Watauga County, North Carolina. Margaret's hands begin to shake as she reads the body of the document, which describes an agreement between Thomas Hannon, identified as the father in the photograph, and a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, owner of a property described as 200 acres of farmland including a house, barn, and outbuildings located in Valle Crucis. The terms of the exchange make Margaret's stomach turn and her mind struggle to accept what she is reading. According to the document, Thomas Hannon agrees to transfer all parental rights and custody of his son, Samuel Hannon, age 12 years, to Jeremiah Blackwood in exchange for full ownership of the aforementioned farm property. The document uses language typical of property transfers, referring to Samuel as if he were an object or commodity rather than a human child. Multiple signatures appear at the bottom, including Thomas Hannon's labored X mark, indicating he could not write his own name. A justice of the peace has signed as witness, lending legal authority to this transaction. The document specifies that Samuel will live and work for Jeremiah Blackwood, helping to maintain the farm in exchange for room, board, and basic necessities until he reaches the age of 21, at which point he will be free to leave if he chooses. Margaret feels physically ill as she reads and rereads the document. Although she knows that child labor was common in the late 19th century and that families sometimes placed children in apprenticeships or working situations out of economic necessity, this document suggests something far more disturbing. The language clearly indicates a permanent transfer of the child, not a temporary work arrangement. The use of the phrase, all parental rights, means Thomas Hannon was essentially severing his relationship with his son and giving another man complete authority over the boy's life. The fact that this exchange occurred in return for land suggests the transaction was motivated purely by the father's desire to improve his own economic situation, with no apparent consideration for Samuel's well-being or wishes. Robert watches Margaret's reaction with concern, and when she finally looks up from the monitor, her eyes are filled with tears. She asks him if he is certain of the translation, whether there might be any possibility of misinterpretation or error in the restoration process. Robert assures her that he has checked and rechecked every letter multiple times, and he has even had a colleague independently verify the text. The document is genuine, captured inadvertently in the background of a family photograph more than 130 years ago. The probability that Thomas Hannon deliberately posed his family in front of this document seems low, suggesting it may have been tacked to the wall and forgotten, or perhaps he was illiterate and did not understand the significance of its placement. Margaret asks to see the full restored photograph again, and Robert brings up the complete image on his largest monitor. Now, knowing what she is looking for, Margaret can clearly see the boy standing apart from his siblings. He must be Samuel, she realizes, and the photograph must have been taken shortly after the transaction was completed. Perhaps the family gathered for this formal photograph as a way of marking the change, or perhaps it was simply coincidental timing. Either way, Samuel's isolation in the image takes on new and heartbreaking meaning. He stands at the edge of his family, already separated even though he is still physically present, his face turned away as if he cannot bear to meet the camera's eye or be fully part of this family moment. Robert has enhanced Samuel's face as much as possible, and Margaret stares at the boy's features, trying to imagine what he must have been feeling as he stood there. He would have been 12 years old enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. The document specified that he would leave his family and go to live with a stranger, to work on a stranger's farm, possibly for the rest of his childhood. The photograph captures Samuel in this liminal moment, still technically part of the Hannon family but already belonging to someone else. The visible tension in his body, the clenched fists, the turned face, all speak of a child experiencing profound betrayal and loss. Margaret spends the next several hours at Robert's studio, documenting the restoration and creating high-resolution copies of both the full photograph and the enhanced details of the document. She pays Robert for his work and thanks him repeatedly, though she feels no joy in this discovery, only a growing sense of obligation. This story needs to be told, she thinks. Samuel Hannon's experience needs to be documented and understood, not only as an individual tragedy but as evidence of the harsh realities faced by families in Appalachian communities during this period of American history. She knows that what happened to Samuel was probably not unique, that economic desperation drove many parents to make terrible choices regarding their children, but having concrete evidence makes the historical reality impossible to ignore or minimize. As Margaret drives home, her mind races with questions and ethical considerations. Should she try to find out what happened to Samuel Hannon after he left his family? Do any descendants exist who should be informed of this discovery? How should this information be presented to avoid sensationalizing a child's suffering while still acknowledging the historical significance? She realizes that this discovery has transformed from an interesting archival project into something much more personal and emotionally complex. She cannot simply catalog these materials and move on. She feels responsible for honoring Samuel's story and ensuring it is told with appropriate care and respect. That evening, Margaret begins researching the Hannon and Blackwood families in earnest. She accesses online genealogical databases, historical census records, county archives, and property transfer documents. The work is painstaking and often frustrating, as records from this period are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. She discovers that Thomas Hannon and his wife Martha had indeed lived in Watauga County in the 1890s, and census records confirm they had 6 children, including a son named Samuel born in 1882. However, Samuel disappears from the family records after 1894, never appearing in subsequent censuses with his parents or siblings. Margaret searches for Jeremiah Blackwood and finds property records showing he owned a substantial farm in Valle Crucis, exactly as described in the document. Valle Crucis is a small valley community in the Blue Ridge Mountains, known for its fertile bottomland and its stark contrast to the rocky, less productive hillside farms where many families struggled to survive. The fact that Thomas Hannon traded his son for this property suggests the land represented a significant improvement in the family's economic circumstances, though Margaret cannot fathom how any parent could make such a choice. She wonders if Martha Hannon had any say in the decision, or if she was simply expected to accept her husband's authority in all matters relating to the family. Over the following days, Margaret becomes increasingly obsessed with uncovering what happened to Samuel after the transfer. She contacts the Watauga County Historical Society and speaks with their research librarian, explaining the discovery and asking for assistance in tracing both families forward through time. The librarian is shocked by the story and agrees to search the Society's archives for any mention of the Hannons or Blackwoods. Margaret also reaches out to genealogy forums online, posting carefully worded requests for information about these families without initially revealing the nature of the document she has discovered. The responses begin to trickle in from various sources. An elderly man who grew up in Valle Crucis remembers hearing stories about the Blackwood farm, which was apparently known for using children from poor families as farm labor. Another researcher provides census data showing that Jeremiah Blackwood continued to own and operate his farm until 1918, when property records indicate the land was sold following his death. However, none of these records mention Samuel Hannon by name, and Margaret begins to worry that the boy's fate may be lost to history, just another forgotten soul whose suffering left no permanent mark on the documentary record. Then Margaret receives an email from a genealogist in Tennessee who specializes in Appalachian family histories. She has been following Margaret's inquiries with interest and has located what she believes is a relevant obituary from a small newspaper published in Bristol, Tennessee, in 1948. The obituary is for a Samuel Hannon, aged 66 years, who died of heart failure. The brief text mentions that the deceased was a farmer who had lived in the Bristol area for most of his adult life, that he had been married to a woman named Louise for 42 years, and that he was survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Most significantly, the obituary states that Samuel was originally from Watauga County, North Carolina, and had moved to Tennessee as a young man seeking better opportunities. Margaret's heart pounds as she reads this information. The ages match perfectly. If Samuel was 12 in 1894, he would have been 66 in 1948. The mention of Watauga County as his place of origin seems too specific to be coincidental. She immediately begins searching for more information about this Samuel Hannon in Bristol, Tennessee, hoping to find additional records that might confirm his identity and reveal more about his life after leaving the Blackwood farm. She discovers that Samuel had purchased a small farm outside Bristol in 1912, at the age of 30, and had worked it successfully until his death. Property records show he had acquired the land through a mortgage, eventually paying it off and passing clear title to his children. Margaret travels to Bristol in early December, driving through the Appalachian Mountains as winter begins to assert its presence over the landscape. The trees stand bare against gray skies, and occasional snow flurries blow across the highway, creating hypnotic patterns in her headlights. Bristol sits on the Tennessee-Virginia border, a city that literally straddles the state line with its main street serving as the boundary between the two states. Margaret checks into a small hotel downtown and spends the evening preparing for her research the next day, reviewing all the information she has gathered and organizing her questions in a logical sequence. The next morning, Margaret visits the Sullivan County Archive and begins searching through deed records, marriage certificates, and local newspaper archives. She finds Samuel Hannon's marriage certificate from 1906, showing he married Louise Patterson when he was 24 and she was 19. The document lists Samuel's occupation as farm laborer and shows his father's name as Thomas Hannon, confirming this is almost certainly the same Samuel from the photograph. Margaret's hands tremble as she holds this document, thinking about how Samuel had waited until he was well past the age specified in the transfer agreement before marrying, as if he needed to ensure he was truly free before building his own family. Margaret locates property records showing Samuel purchased 40 acres of land in 1912 for $800, a substantial sum for a young farm laborer at that time. She wonders how Samuel saved that money, what kind of work he did after leaving Jeremiah Blackwood's farm at age 21, and whether he had any contact with his birth family after the transfer. The deed shows Samuel signed his own name in clear, practiced handwriting, suggesting he had received at least basic education at some point, either before leaving his family or during his years with Blackwood. This small detail gives Margaret hope that Samuel's experience with Blackwood had not been entirely without benefit, though it does nothing to excuse or justify the circumstances of the transfer. The Bristol newspaper archives yield several brief mentions of Samuel Hannon over the years. A notice from 1914 announces the birth of his first child, a daughter named Margaret, and similar notices mark the births of 2 sons in subsequent years. Margaret feels a strange connection to the daughter who shares her name, wondering if Samuel had chosen it for some specific reason or if it was simply a common name of the period. The newspaper also contains a small article from 1932 describing how Samuel Hannon had helped organize a cooperative marketing association for small farmers in the area, allowing them to sell their produce collectively for better prices. The article portrays him as a respected member of the farming community and a leader in local agricultural improvement efforts. Margaret searches for any indication that Samuel maintained contact with his birth family in North Carolina, but she finds nothing in the available records. She checks census data for Thomas and Martha Hannon in the decades following 1894 and discovers they did indeed move to the Valle Cruces property, where they continued to farm with their remaining children. Thomas Hannon died in 1908 at the age of 62, and Martha followed in 1916. The census records show their other children gradually left the farm as they reached adulthood, marrying and establishing their own households. The farm itself passed through several owners over the 20th century before eventually being subdivided and developed for residential use. The Sullivan County Library. Margaret speaks with the local history librarian, an energetic woman in her 50s named Patricia Coleman who has lived in Bristol her entire life. Margaret explains her research and shows Patricia copies of the restored photograph and the document. Patricia is visibly moved by the story and immediately begins offering suggestions for additional research avenues. She mentions that Bristol has a small genealogical society that meets monthly and suggests Margaret might find people there who remember the Hannon family or who might be descended from them. Patricia also recalls that some older African American residents in the area have talked about the practice of poor white families essentially selling their children during the late 19th century, suggesting Samuel's experience was part of a larger pattern of exploitation driven by economic desperation. Patricia helps Margaret search through the library's collection of local oral histories, recorded interviews with elderly residents conducted during the 1970s and 80s as part of a community heritage project. They find an interview with a man named Robert Patterson, recorded in 1979 when he was 92 years old, who mentions knowing Samuel Hannon when both were young men working as farm laborers in the area. Patterson describes Samuel as hardworking and determined but also deeply private about his childhood and family background. When asked about his family in North Carolina, Samuel would reportedly change the subject or give vague answers, suggesting he preferred not to discuss his past. Patterson also mentions that Samuel was generous with younger workers, often helping them learn new skills and advocating for fair treatment and wages. The oral history provides Margaret with a glimpse of Samuel as an actual person rather than just a name in historical documents. She envisions him as a man carrying the burden of his childhood trauma while trying to build a better life for himself and his family. His reluctance to discuss his past makes perfect sense given the nature of what happened to him, and his advocacy for fair treatment of workers suggests he understood firsthand what it meant to be vulnerable and exploited. Margaret feels increasingly determined to tell Samuel's story in a way that honors his dignity and resilience while not shying away from the harsh historical realities he experienced. Patricia suggests Margaret try to locate Samuel Hannon's descendants, who might have family stories, photographs, or documents that could add personal dimension to the historical record. She helps Margaret search current phone directories and online databases, and they eventually find contact information for several people in the Bristol area with the surname Hannon. Margaret spends the afternoon making phone calls, explaining her research to skeptical strangers and asking if they might be related to Samuel Hannon, who farmed outside Bristol in the early 20th century. Most calls lead nowhere, but eventually she reaches an elderly woman named Ellen Hannon Morris who immediately recognizes Samuel's name as her grandfather. Ellen is 78 years old and lives in a retirement community on the outskirts of Bristol. She sounds surprised but pleased to hear from someone researching her grandfather's history, and she invites Margaret to visit her the following morning. Margaret can barely sleep that night, thinking about meeting someone who had actually known Samuel, who had memories of him as a living, breathing person rather than just a collection of documents and dates. She wonders what Ellen knows about her grandfather's childhood and whether Samuel ever shared his story with his family, or if he carried that burden in silence throughout his life. Ellen Hannon Morris lives in a comfortable assisted living apartment filled with family photographs and mementos. She greets Margaret warmly, offering coffee and homemade cookies while explaining that she is thrilled someone is taking an interest in her grandfather's history. Ellen is sharp and articulate, her memory for details impressive despite her age. She shows Margaret photographs of Samuel taken in his later years, and Margaret is struck by how much she can see of the serious boy from the 1894 photograph in the face of the elderly man. Samuel's eyes in these later photographs carry a sadness that even smiles cannot quite dispel, a weight that Margaret now understands originates in that traumatic childhood transfer. Ellen talks about her grandfather with obvious love and respect. She describes him as a gentle man who worked hard, loved his family fiercely, and was known in the community for his integrity and fairness. He told stories about farming and would teach his grandchildren about plants, animals, and weather patterns, passing on knowledge he had acquired through decades of agricultural work. However, Ellen confirms what Margaret suspected: Samuel rarely spoke about his childhood or his family in North Carolina. When asked about his parents or siblings, he would grow quiet and change the subject. His children and grandchildren learned not to press him on these topics, respecting his obvious discomfort even as they remained curious about the parts of his life he kept hidden. Margaret decides to show Ellen the restored photograph and the document. She explains carefully what she has discovered, watching Ellen's face as the elderly woman processes this shocking information about her grandfather's childhood. Ellen's hands shake as she holds the printed copies, tears streaming down her face as she reads the transfer document and then studies the photograph of young Samuel standing apart from his family. She whispers that she had always sensed there was some deep wound in her grandfather's past, some trauma he carried but could not speak about, and now she finally understands what caused that pain. The knowledge is devastating but also somehow validating, explaining the silences and the sadness that occasionally shadowed even his happiest moments. Ellen tells Margaret that Samuel died when she was only 18, so her memories of him come from her childhood and teenage years. She recalls one incident vividly. She must have been about 12 years old, the same age Samuel was when he was traded to Jeremiah Blackwood, and she was complaining about some minor injustice, perhaps being required to do chores when she wanted to play with friends. Her grandfather had looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a combination of pain and fierce protectiveness, and he had said that children should never be treated as property or burdens, that they deserved love and protection and the freedom to be children. At the time, Ellen had not understood the intensity of his reaction, but now it makes perfect sense. Samuel was speaking from his own traumatic experience, projecting his values onto his granddaughter's very different circumstances. Ellen shares other memories that take on new meaning in light of this discovery. Samuel never went back to North Carolina, even when his children suggested family trips to the mountains. He was adamant about this, insisting he had no desire to see that place again. When one of his sons wanted to name a child Thomas after Samuel's father, Samuel had strongly opposed the idea, suggesting other names instead. He eventually allowed it, but Ellen remembers her grandmother mentioning how upset Samuel had been about it, unable to articulate why he objected so strongly to honoring his father's memory. Now Ellen understands he could not bear to hear that name spoken with love and respect, could not pretend his father deserved such honor after what he had done. Margaret asks Ellen if she knows what happened during Samuel's years with Jeremiah Blackwood, between ages 12 and 21, but Ellen shakes her head. Samuel never mentioned Blackwood or talked about that period of his life at all. It is as if those 9 years simply did not exist in any narrative he shared with his family. Ellen speculates that the experience must have been difficult, perhaps even abusive, given Samuel's complete silence about it. She mentions that her grandfather had several scars on his hands and arms, the kind that come from hard physical labor and probably some injuries, and he always deflected questions about how he got them. Ellen wonders if those scars were acquired during his time at the Blackwood farm, permanent physical reminders of his childhood exploitation. Ellen asks Margaret what she plans to do with this information, and Margaret explains her belief that Samuel's story deserves to be documented and shared as part of the historical record of life in Appalachia during the late 19th century. She wants to write an article for a historical journal and possibly work with local historical societies to create an exhibit or presentation that would educate people about the economic conditions that led families to make such desperate choices. Ellen gives her blessing to this project, saying she believes her grandfather would want his story told if it might help people understand the struggles of that time and perhaps prevent similar exploitation today. She shares one of Samuel's oft-repeated sayings, "Every child deserves better than what came before." Ellen interprets this now as Samuel's determination to break the cycle of trauma and deprivation, to ensure his descendants never experienced what he endured. Before Margaret leaves, Ellen gives her a small photograph of Samuel taken in the 1940s, showing him standing in a field of tobacco with his arm around his wife Louise. He looks content in the image, a man who has found peace despite his difficult beginning. Ellen also provides contact information for her cousins, Samuel's other grandchildren, who might want to know about this discovery and contribute their own memories to the historical record. Margaret promises to keep Ellen informed as her research progresses and to share any additional information she discovers about Samuel's life or the circumstances of the transfer. Driving back to Asheville, Margaret feels the weight of responsibility that comes with telling someone else's story, particularly a story involving trauma and exploitation. She knows she must be careful to present Samuel not as a victim to be pitied but as a complete human being who survived terrible circumstances and built a meaningful life despite his traumatic beginning. She wants to honor his resilience and agency while still being honest about the injustice he experienced. The balance will be difficult to achieve, requiring both historical rigor and narrative sensitivity. Back in Asheville, Margaret spends the cold January days conducting additional research and beginning to write. She contacts historians specializing in Appalachian economic history and child welfare history, seeking context for Samuel's story. They explain that the practice of essentially selling children, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was not uncommon in regions where poverty was endemic and survival often required desperate measures. Some families bound their children out as indentured servants or apprentices, while others made informal arrangements that amounted to transfers of custody in exchange for various forms of compensation. The legal system of the time offered little protection for children in such circumstances, particularly in rural areas where authorities rarely intervened in what were considered family matters. One historian Margaret consults points her toward court records from Watauga County in the 1890s. And after weeks of searching through barely legible handwritten documents, she discovers additional cases similar to Samuel's. In 1896, a father agreed to transfer custody of his two daughters to a widow in exchange for forgiveness of a debt. In 1898, a family gave their youngest son to a childless couple in return for a milk cow and 3 pigs. These transactions were sometimes recorded in official documents, suggesting they were considered legally and socially acceptable within that context, though the emotional impact on the children involved was never acknowledged or considered relevant. Margaret is both horrified by the prevalence of such arrangements and grateful to have additional evidence that Samuel's experience was part of a larger social pattern rather than an isolated incident of unusual cruelty. Margaret also researches Jeremiah Blackwood more extensively, trying to understand what kind of man would enter into such an agreement and what Samuel's life might have been like on the Blackwood farm. She discovers that Blackwood was unmarried and had no children of his own, which might explain his willingness to take custody of a 12-year-old boy. Census records describe him as a farmer with substantial holdings, placing him in the upper tier of local society in terms of wealth and property. However, Margaret finds no indication that Blackwood was ever charged with any crimes or that his treatment of workers or dependents was considered particularly harsh by the standards of the time. This absence of evidence does not prove Samuel was treated well, but it suggests that whatever happened to him during those years fell within the range of what was considered normal or at least not worth intervening over. Margaret attempts to locate any records from the Blackwood farm itself, hoping for journals, account books, or correspondence that might mention Samuel, but these materials have apparently been lost to time. The property changed hands multiple times in the 20th century, and no subsequent owners appear to have preserved historical documents from the Blackwood era. Margaret even visits Via Crucis and walks the land where the Blackwood farm once stood, now subdivided into several residential properties. She tries to imagine 12-year-old Samuel arriving here, leaving behind everything familiar to work for a stranger in exchange for his father's economic advancement. The mountains rising on all sides would have been both beautiful and imprisoning, a landscape that held Samuel in place through legal obligation and lack of alternatives. While in Via Crucis, Margaret stops at the local historical museum and speaks with volunteers about the Blackwood and Hannon families. An elderly volunteer named Douglas Pritchard listens to Margaret's story and then mentions that his grandmother had worked briefly as a cook for Jeremiah Blackwood in the early 1900s. Douglas is not certain, but he believes his grandmother mentioned a young man working on the farm who seemed troubled and kept mostly to himself. Douglas cannot remember if his grandmother ever said the young man's name, and she has been dead for 40 years, so there is no way to verify whether she was referring to Samuel. However, the description matches what Margaret has learned about Samuel's personality and demeanor during his young adult years in Bristol. Margaret returns to Asheville with a wealth of historical context, but also with many questions that will never be answered. She does not know how Samuel was treated during his 9 years with Jeremiah Blackwood, whether he was physically abused or simply worked hard, whether he received the basic education evidenced by his later literacy or if that came after he left the farm. She does not know if Samuel ever tried to contact his birth family or if they ever reached out to him, whether there was any reconciliation or if the transfer represented a permanent and complete severing of family bonds. She does not know what specific experiences led Samuel to move to Tennessee rather than remaining in North Carolina, or how he met his wife Louise, or what dreams and hopes sustained him through those difficult years of transition from childhood to adulthood. What Margaret does know is that Samuel Hannon survived his traumatic childhood and created a life marked by stability, success, and love. He married and raised 3 children who all spoke of him with affection and respect. He owned his own land, beholden to no one, free in a way he had not been as a child. He contributed positively to his community and was remembered decades after his death as a good man who helped others. In some ways, his story is one of remarkable resilience and triumph over circumstances that could easily have broken him. Margaret decides to frame her article around this narrative of survival and recovery while still being honest about the exploitation and trauma Samuel experienced. Margaret's article, titled The Hannon Transfer, Child Exploitation and Survival in 19th Century Appalachia, is published in the spring in the Journal of Southern History. The article combines the documentary evidence of the transfer, the social and economic context of Appalachian poverty in the 1890s, and the biographical information Margaret gathered about Samuel's later life. She includes the restored photograph with permission from the estate and from Ellen Hannon Morris, who has officially released it into the public domain for historical and educational purposes. The image of young Samuel standing apart from his family becomes the article's most powerful element, a visual representation of the human cost of economic desperation and the casualness with which children's welfare was sacrificed to adult interests. The article generates significant attention within academic circles and is picked up by several regional newspapers. Margaret receives dozens of emails from readers sharing their own family stories of children bound out, transferred, or otherwise separated from their families due to economic necessity during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some people are angry, viewing their ancestors' actions as unforgivable betrayals, while others are more sympathetic, arguing that desperate people in impossible circumstances cannot be judged by modern standards. Margaret does not try to resolve this debate, believing both perspectives have validity and that each family must come to terms with its own history in its own way. Ellen Hannon Morris contacts Margaret after the article's publication to thank her for treating Samuel's story with respect and sensitivity. Ellen has shared the article with her extended family, Samuel's other grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they have decided to hold a family reunion in Bristol that summer to honor Samuel's memory and to ensure younger generations understand their family history. Ellen invites Margaret to attend, and Margaret accepts, honored to be included in this family moment. She has come to feel personally invested in Samuel's story, and she wants to see how his descendants remember and celebrate him. The reunion takes place in July on a warm Saturday afternoon at a park in Bristol. More than 50 of Samuel's descendants gather, representing 4 generations from Ellen's generation down to young children who never knew Samuel but who now understand they are part of his legacy. Ellen has arranged for copies of the restored photograph to be distributed to every family, and she has created a display board showing Samuel's timeline from his birth in 1882 through his death in 1948, highlighting his accomplishments and the family he created. Margaret is introduced to the crowd and speaks briefly about her research and what drew her to Samuel's story. She emphasizes how Samuel transformed his trauma into motivation to create better circumstances for his own family, breaking a cycle that could have continued across generations. After Margaret's presentation, family members share their own memories and stories. Samuel's grandson Thomas, now in his 60s and named for the grandfather Samuel could never forgive, talks about the lessons Samuel taught him about treating all people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Samuel's great-granddaughter Jennifer, a social worker, describes how learning about Samuel's childhood has informed her understanding of intergenerational trauma and resilience. Several people mention how Samuel's insistence that children deserve better has become something of a family motto, repeated across generations and applied to decisions about education, healthcare, and family relationships. Margaret realizes that Samuel's legacy extends far beyond the facts of his biography, living on in the values and choices of people he never met. As the reunion continues with food and socializing, Margaret finds herself in conversation with Samuel's great-great-granddaughter, a college student named Sarah who is majoring in history. Sarah expresses gratitude for Margaret's work uncovering Samuel's story, saying it has made her family's history real and meaningful in new ways. She mentions that she is considering focusing her studies on Appalachian social history, partly inspired by learning about Samuel's experience. Margaret is moved by this, realizing that one consequence of her research is inspiring a new generation of scholars to examine these difficult aspects of regional history. Samuel's story, hidden for more than a century behind water damage and fading emulsion, is now teaching and influencing people he could never have imagined. Margaret spends several hours at the reunion, meeting Samuel's descendants and hearing their perspectives on his story. Some are angry at Thomas and Martha Hannon for what they did to Samuel, struggling to understand how parents could make such a choice. Others are more forgiving, pointing out that Thomas and Martha's other children apparently fared better because of the improved economic circumstances the Valle Crucis farm provided, suggesting the transfer might have been motivated by a desperate utilitarian calculation rather than simple callousness. Still others focus less on assigning blame and more on celebrating how Samuel overcame his traumatic beginning, arguing that the most important lesson is resilience rather than victimhood. Margaret listens to all these perspectives without judgment, understanding that every family must process difficult history in its own way. As the reunion winds down and families begin to leave, Ellen approaches Margaret and presses something into her hand. It is the photograph of Samuel standing in the tobacco field with his wife Louise, the one Ellen had shown Margaret during their first meeting. Ellen explains that she wants Margaret to have it, to remember that Samuel's story did not end with trauma and exploitation but continued into decades of peace, love, and accomplishment. Margaret is deeply touched by this gift and promises to treasure it. She understands that Ellen is giving her more than just a photograph. She is giving her permission to feel some measure of hope and satisfaction in how Samuel's story concluded, despite its terrible beginning. Driving back to Asheville that evening, Margaret reflects on the months she has spent with Samuel Hannon's story. When she first discovered that water-damaged photograph in Clara Hannon's cedar chest, she could not have imagined where the restoration would lead or how deeply she would become connected to the life of a boy who died more than 70 years ago. The discovery of the transfer document transformed what might have been a simple preservation project into something far more significant, a recovery of hidden history, a documentation of injustice, and ultimately a testament to human resilience. Margaret thinks about the careful preservation that allowed this story to survive, Clara Hannon protecting the family photograph even though she probably never knew about the document it contained, Robert Chen's skill and dedication in restoration, and now Ellen and her family ensuring Samuel's story will be known and remembered by future generations. Margaret also thinks about the broader implications of Samuel's story for understanding Appalachian history and the lives of ordinary people in the late 19th century. Academic history often focuses on the famous, the powerful, and the documented, leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of how most people actually lived. Samuel's story provides a window into one family's struggle with poverty and the terrible choices that struggle produced. It reveals how children were sometimes viewed as economic assets or burdens rather than as individuals with inherent rights and dignity. It shows how trauma can be carried across decades, shaping a person's entire life even as they build outward success and happiness. And it demonstrates the importance of preserving historical materials, even damaged or seemingly insignificant items, because we never know what stories they might contain or what lessons they might teach us about our shared past. Margaret's work on the Hannon case leads to additional projects and opportunities. She is invited to speak at conferences about photographic restoration and hidden historical documents. Local historical societies ask her to examine their collections for similar cases of obscured or damaged materials that might contain important information. She begins working on a book about child labor and exploitation in Appalachia during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, using Samuel's story as a central case study but placing it within the larger context of economic and social history. The book project will take years to complete, requiring extensive research and careful writing, but Margaret feels energized by the work and committed to telling these difficult stories with both honesty and compassion. 2 years after the reunion, Margaret receives a letter from Sarah, the great-great-granddaughter who was studying history in college. Sarah is now in graduate school working on her master's thesis about child welfare in rural America during the Progressive Era, and she writes to thank Margaret for inspiring her academic direction. Sarah has located several other cases similar to Samuel's and is documenting how social reform movements eventually led to child labor laws and legal protections that would have made such transfers illegal. She sees her research as honoring Samuel's memory by ensuring that the systems that failed him are studied, understood, and prevented from recurring. Margaret writes back encouragingly, pleased to see how Samuel's story continues to ripple outward, influencing people and scholarship in ways that extend his legacy far beyond his own lifetime. Margaret keeps the photograph Ellen gave her on her desk, where she sees it every day as she works. The image of Samuel and Louise standing together in their field reminds her of why she does this work: to recover forgotten lives, to honor the struggles of ordinary people, and to ensure that trauma and injustice, even from more than a century ago, are not erased or forgotten. Samuel Hannon never had the chance to tell his own story in his own words, never had the opportunity to publicly confront what happened to him or to see justice done. But through the accidental preservation of a document in a family photograph, through the skill of a restoration specialist, and through the dedication of a historian who refused to let his story remain hidden, Samuel's experience has been documented and shared. His life, marked by both terrible hardship and remarkable resilience, has become part of the historical record, teaching new generations about the past and perhaps inspiring them to build a future where no child is ever again treated as property or traded for land. On a cold November afternoon, exactly 3 years after she first discovered the photograph in Clara Hannon's estate sale, Margaret returns to Valle Crucis. She has arranged for a historical marker to be placed near the site of the former Blackwood farm, commemorating Samuel Hannon and acknowledging what happened to him in this place. The marker is simple, stating the basic facts without sensationalism: that Samuel Hannon was transferred from his family to Jeremiah Blackwood in 1894 in exchange for farmland, that he worked here until reaching adulthood, and that he went on to build a successful life in Tennessee. The marker notes that Samuel's story represents the experiences of many children whose labor and well-being were sacrificed to economic necessity during this period of American history, and it invites visitors to remember that behind every historical statistic are individual human beings who suffered, survived, and persevered. Ellen Hannon Morris attends the marker dedication ceremony, now 80 years old but still sharp and engaged. She brings several family members, including Sarah, who has just completed her master's degree and is applying to doctoral programs. About 30 people gather for the brief ceremony, a mix of local residents, historical society members, and Hannon family descendants. Margaret speaks about the importance of remembering difficult history and honoring those who survived it. Ellen adds her own words, describing her grandfather as a man who transformed pain into purpose and whose quiet strength influenced everyone who knew him. The group observes a moment of silence, and then the marker is unveiled, a permanent acknowledgement that what happened here mattered and should not be forgotten. After the ceremony, as people mingle and share coffee and cookies provided by the local historical society, Margaret stands alone for a moment looking at the marker and the mountain landscape surrounding it. She thinks about 12-year-old Samuel arriving here in 1894, frightened and betrayed, facing an uncertain future. She imagines him working these fields, growing from a child into a young man, carrying the knowledge of what his father had done and somehow finding the strength to survive and eventually thrive. She thinks about the photograph that captured this moment in his life, the document that recorded the transaction, and the chain of circumstances that brought these materials to her attention more than a century later. The past is never truly past, Margaret reflects. It lives in us, shapes us, and occasionally reveals itself in unexpected ways, demanding to be acknowledged and understood. As Margaret drives away from Valle Crucis that evening, the mountains dark against the twilight sky, she feels a sense of completion. Samuel Hannon's story has been told. His trauma has been documented. His resilience has been celebrated. His descendants understand their history. And